You've found just stories, simple, heartfelt moments from real lives, stories that remind us how connected we all are through love, loss, and hope. Get cozy. The stories are about to begin. Eleanor Smith lived for her son David, seeing him as the main reward of her life. Her relationship with her daughter Claire was cool, almost detached. Independent and self-sufficient, Claire didn't cause her mother anxiety about her future. All her care, all her thoughts were focused solely on David. Although David had long since grown up and become a successful man, his mother continued to consider him helpless. She was convinced that without her constant control and endless help, he simply wouldn't be able to cope with life. This was a profound delusion, but no arguments could shake her certainty. David tried many times to loosen his mother's grip, but it was all in vain. In the end, he gave up, learning to exist under the weight of her hyperprotection, which, though sometimes hindering, seemed inevitable. The real difficulties began when David decided to get married. Helen was already the third girl seriously vying for the place of his life partner. The two previous ones couldn't withstand the pressure of the overly caring mother and fled, unable to tolerate the total control. Helen, however, turned out to be unusually patient and understanding. David had told her in advance about all the nuances of his mother's nature and warned her that they would have to live together. Helen accepted this news with surprising calmness. "Dave, you don't choose your parents," she said. "I'll try to find common ground with your mom." She added that she was ready to endure a lot for the sake of the man she loved, because his mother had given him life. However, Helen didn't yet imagine how inventive and destructive Mrs. Smith's nitpicking could be. Ahead of her lay the first meeting with her future mother-in-law, a meeting on which their shared future depended. Helen was very nervous, understanding the full importance of this moment. David hadn't yet told his mother about the engagement, which added to the tension. Helen prepared carefully, learning from David about Mrs. Smith's preferences. She baked her future mother-in-law's favorite honey cake, chose an outfit, and waited for her fiancé with trepidation. David arrived with a bouquet, picked up Helen, and they set off for his parents' house. Mrs. Smith was also preparing for the visit of her future daughter-in-law, but her mood was already negative. Even before the meeting, she was sure she wouldn't like the girl. In her mind, no one could ever love and care for her son the way she did. She had no doubt about her own exceptionalism. They met in the hallway. Mrs. Smith looked benevolent, smartly dressed and with light makeup. But from the threshold, Helen physically felt the coldness and rejection emanating from her. For the first time in her life, she felt so clearly that she was completely unwelcome. However, Helen was not used to backing down and was ready to endure this trial for David's sake. At dinner, Mrs. Smith asked standard questions about family, education, work, and housing. Helen answered calmly and confidently. She had something to be proud of. She grew up in an intellectual family. Her father was a colonel, her mother a surgeon. Helen herself graduated from medical school and successfully worked as a gastroenterologist in a prestigious private clinic. Helen's story made an impression on Mrs. Smith. David's previous girlfriends had been much simpler, a manicurist, a saleswoman. Helen, on the other hand, was from a respectable family, with a good education and manners. Her mother-in-law even thought she might have approved of her if the girl hadn't been vying for the role of wife to her David. Overall, the dinner passed without Yavnik scandals. David drove Helen home and returned, knowing that a serious conversation with his mother was unavoidable. She was waiting for him in the living room, and from her tense look, it was clear that Helen still hadn't pleased her. David braced himself internally, preparing to defend his choice. He decided not to wait, but to go on the offensive immediately. "Mom, well, what is it? Something's wrong again? What didn't you like about Helen?" he asked directly. His mother pretended to be surprised by the question. "Why do you think I didn't like her?" Mrs. Smith countered. David continued, "She's quite a nice girl, educated, cultured, pleasant to talk to. But there's always a but, isn't there?" His mother interrupted, no longer hiding her mood. David sighed. "Yes, if it weren't for one but." I think she's boring." This was such a ridiculous quibble that David involuntarily laughed. "Mom, are you serious? Boring? Why did you decide that?" he asked, trying to understand his mother's logic. Mrs. Smith shrugged. "I don't know. That's how it seemed to me." It was obvious that she simply hadn't found a more substantial reason for dissatisfaction. "How are you going to live with her? Have you thought about that?" She returned to her main concern. "I'll live with her just fine, Mommy," David answered calmly. "Stop looking for a black cat in a dark room, especially if it's not there." He walked over to her and took her hands. "Helen is a very good girl, calm, well-mannered, cultured, exactly the kind you dreamed of for me, Mom." David looked his mother in the eyes. "Listen, I'm 32 years old. I want a family and children. How much longer should I keep choosing?" Mrs. Smith understood that her son was right. It was high time for him to start his own life. But she so didn't want to share him with anyone. Even the thought of grandchildren didn't warm her heart. She only needed him. "You're right, son. It's time for you to get married," she began her usual song. "It's just that I think you're still a little boy who needs his mom and her care more than anything in the world. But you've grown up, and your mother isn't needed anymore." David gently interrupted her. "Mommy, don't say silly things. I'll always need you and will live with you. I'm not going anywhere." He continued to persuade her, painting a picture of their future life together. "We'll still talk, have dinner together, go shopping, go to the dacha," he said. "It's just that there will be one more person living in our house, and maybe not just one over time. It's much more fun that way, and you won't be alone when I'm away on business trips." David looked at his mother with hope. Mrs. Smith couldn't bear that look. She had never been able to refuse her favorite. After a long pause, she finally said, "All right, get married. I won't interfere." David was overjoyed, hugged and kissed her. "Mommy, I knew you were the wisest woman in the world," he exclaimed. 2 months later, David and Helen got married, and the girl moved into her husband's house. The first few weeks went surprisingly smoothly. Helen couldn't even believe her happiness. Mrs. Smith was benevolent, chatted nicely with her daughter-in-law, and tried in every way to help her. It seemed her promise was sincere. But then David left for a week-long business trip, and the mask fell off. The nitpicking poured out like from a horn of plenty. "You're not ironing David's shirts right. You didn't put enough salt in the soup. You put too much salt in the porridge. You put the cups in the wrong place. You can't sit in this armchair. This is David's armchair. All members of our family know that." Helen couldn't understand how a person could change so drastically, but she silently endured, trying to correct all her mistakes. The real nightmare began when Helen brought a kitten into the house. David had said they always had cats, and Helen thought a fluffy baby would improve relations. She had discussed the purchase with her husband, and he approved the idea. But Mrs. Smith had a different opinion. "Why did you bring this flea-ridden thing into the house? Do you know I can't stand cat hair? You're doing this to spite me," the mother-in-law exploded. That's when Helen lost her patience. She spoke calmly, but with a firmness that surprised Mrs. Smith. "My dear Mrs. Smith, what are you trying to achieve? That David and I get divorced? Well, that's not going to happen. We love each other," Helen continued. "I discussed getting the kitten with your son, and he assured me that you always had cats in the house and that you would surely like this idea. But it turns out that even this you are ready to deny just because I brought the kitten." Helen paused, gathering her strength for the main point. "The only thing you will achieve with this attitude towards me is that we will move out to a rented apartment, and you will be left alone," she stated. "Does that option suit you?" "I don't think so." Helen looked her mother-in-law directly in the eyes. "So, either we live together peacefully, or we leave. You can't count on us breaking up. I'm expecting a baby." Mrs. Smith looked at her daughter-in-law with completely different eyes. "Well, it turns out you have character, girl," she thought to herself. "You want to fight with me? Well, well." But out loud she said something completely different, softening her tone. "I don't want you to move somewhere else. maybe I am being a little critical of you, but you must understand me. I am a mother. I want my son to be happy." "And you think I came into his life to ruin it?" Helen calmly countered. "Have I given you any reason to think so badly of me?" "No." Mrs. Smith turned to leave, but then turned back to her daughter-in-law. "All right, let's live peacefully," she said, "especially since you mustn't worry." After that conversation, Mrs. Smith's behavior really changed. She stopped picking on Helen about every little thing, tried to spend more time in her room, avoiding unnecessary encounters. Helen noticed that the kitten, named Jasper, often visited his grandmother. She held him in her arms even more often than Helen herself. Life in her mother-in-law's house gradually improved. 2 years passed. Helen and David had a son, whom they named Edward, after David's father. His father had been a policeman and died tragically in the line of duty. Mrs. Smith always remembered her husband fondly, while David barely remembered his father, as he was only 4 years old when he passed away. Eddie grew up, and his grandmother actively participated in his life. She often played with her grandson, took him for walks while Helen did housework. Mrs. Smith's attitude towards her daughter-in-law hadn't changed internally. She still disliked her, but now she did so silently. David worked a lot, often going on business trips. Their life flowed calmly and measuredly. But, as often happens, unforeseen circumstances burst into the quiet family harbor. David had to go on a month-long business trip abroad. Helen really didn't want to let him go, but there was no choice. The trip was necessary. A couple of days after he left, Helen noticed that Mrs. Smith was behaving strangely. She became silent, stopped playing with her grandson. Gathering her courage, Helen decided to talk to her mother-in-law. "Mrs. Smith, is something bothering you?" she asked hesitantly. "Maybe something hurts? Tell me. I'm a doctor." Her mother-in-law answered calmly, "Nothing hurts. Everything is fine." But Helen didn't believe her and decided to observe. The next day, she accidentally overheard Mrs. Smith talking on the phone, asking for help. Helen didn't catch the details, but she clearly heard the words, "I need your support." Mrs. Smith had many acquaintances and relatives, but she could only ask for such support from her closest ones. Helen called David. "Dave, you need to talk to your mom urgently," she said. "Something is happening with her, and she's not telling me anything. I heard her asking someone for help on the phone. You talked to her? Maybe it's something with her health? I can help." David promised to look into it. "Okay, Ellie, I'll definitely talk to her today," he replied. "And in general, how are things with you?" Helen repeated that everything was fine, but his mother was not herself, and it was making her uneasy. David understood her concern. "I understand," he said. "I'll call you tonight after I talk to her." In the evening, David called back and reported that his mother's test results were bad. The doctor at the clinic insisted on urgent surgery, but his mother was very scared. "Ellie, try talking to her again," he asked. "I asked Mom to show you the tests, and she seemed to agree. But show her care and attention, you know her. For my sake, of course." Helen sincerely replied, "Dave, I'm worried about her myself. I'll do everything I can." She resolutely entered her mother-in-law's room. "Mrs. Smith, I understand that you don't particularly like me and consider me a bad daughter-in-law," Helen began. "But please, let me help you anyway." And then something happened that Helen had not expected at all. Mrs. Smith burst into bitter tears. Helen was frightened. "Mrs. Smith, what is it? Is it that bad? Is it cancer?" she asked with alarm. "No," her mother-in-law replied through tears. "It's just that I turned to my daughter. She doesn't have time to go to hospitals with me." "But that's understandable. I always only focused on David. She has reason to be offended with me." Her sister and best friend were also busy with their own lives. "My godmother and best friend are at the dacha. They won't come to the city for me," Mrs. Smith continued. "They say, 'You have children,' and it turns out that no one cares about me, and I'm scared, you understand? Very scared." Helen moved closer. Okay, let's calm down, she said softly. Tell me everything in detail. Mrs. Smith showed the test results, explaining that the doctor insisted on immediate surgery, claiming that time had been lost. Helen carefully studied the results and then looked at her mother-in-law in surprise. Which clinic were you at? Our District 1? She asked. I don't see anything terrible, let alone irreversible, in your tests. Helen was confident. I'll call my gynecologist now and we'll go for a consultation tomorrow, she suggested. I'm sure this is some kind of mistake. Mrs. Smith looked at her daughter-in-law with hope. Really? She asked. Really, Helen answered firmly. The next day, Helen and Mrs. Smith went to the medical center where Helen worked, to her acquaintance, the gynecologist. The doctor listened to the complaints, studied the tests, and was extremely surprised by the district doctor's recommendation for surgery. Mrs. Smith, I assure you, you have no indications for surgery, he said. I will prescribe you treatment. You'll go through it, and everything will be fine. Mrs. Smith cried again, but this time from relief. When they left the center, Mrs. Smith stopped and took Helen's hand. Ellie, forgive me, please, she said, looking her daughter-in-law in the eyes. I was very unhappy. I picked on you for no reason. I am guilty before you. She started crying again. And you turned out to be the only person who came to my aid. After all, if I had gone to the doctor with someone else, they would have sent me for surgery. No one would have bothered to look closely, her mother-in-law continued. Thank you, my girl. Thank you very much. I promise you, I will be the most loving mother-in-law in the world. Helen also couldn't hold back tears, touched by such a sincere confession. It's okay, Mrs. Smith, Helen said, wiping away tears. We are one family and should help and support each other. Her mother-in-law sighed. In life, it's often the opposite. Strangers support and help, while your own are too busy. Helen smiled. Well, then we are the exception to the rule. Let's go home, she suggested. Eddie is waiting for us there with my mom. Suddenly, Mrs. Smith stopped abruptly and looked at her daughter-in-law again. Listen to me now. Just don't interrupt, she said seriously. I want to thank you, so that you see not just in words, but in deeds, that I have changed. She had made an important decision. I will sign over my share of the apartment to you, so that you and David are always on equal footing. That will be fair. But, Helen tried to object, stunned by this turn of events. Now don't argue with me, her mother-in-law interrupted playfully but firmly. On this matter, I will be categorical, strict, as a mother-in-law should be. She smiled, and in her eyes, for the first time in a long time, Helen saw genuine warmth. Mrs. Smith hugged her daughter-in-law.